So there's kind of a redemptive narrative that runs through the book as well. It's about the emotional work we can do towards the end of life if we have the opportunity to know that we're dying, you know? Okay, so I'm going to read you about my mother's death. After my father died, and he finally died of pneumonia on a hospice unit, we had attempted to get the pacemaker turned off, which is both moral in my book and legal, and had been refused by the cardiologist. After his death, my mother, it became clear, had 2 leaky heart valves, and she was really short of breath. I took her to Brigham and Women's Hospital in Boston, which was like, it's an absolute leader for late life cardiac surgery. And we went into the doctor's office to discuss this potential surgery, and my mother said, and he said, "Why are you here?" And my mother said, "To ask questions." She had become a totally different person from the person who had simply said, "Oh, okay," and put the pacemaker in and then regretted it, you know. And he talked very, very openly about the risks of both stroke and dementia for late life open heart surgery. And she said, "If I have a stroke, I want you to let me go." And she was almost crying. And he said, "But what about just a little stroke, a little weakness on one side?" And she also showed him her do not resuscitate bracelet she had already on her ankle, this kind of hospital-issued bracelet that you have to have in Connecticut to stop the EMTs from reviving you. And she said, "I want this to be honored." And he basically said, "No, we will not honor it. It would not be fair to the team. We're going to put a lot of effort into trying to save your life, and I just won't do it." And some people feel like, "Oh, what a terrible doctor." But my mother and I both really appreciated it because he was absolutely honest. And he didn't blue sky us. He didn't say everything's going to be fine. He didn't say, I'll agree to anything, but when we're in the heat of it, I'm going to do what I think's best. I mean, we really had a lot of respect for him. And when she came out from that, she was sent off for another angiogram or something. And then she came back, she put on her coat, and she said to me, "I will not do it." And over the next 5 months, okay, now I'll read. Otherwise, okay. My mother spent her last spring and summer arranging house repairs, thinning out my father's bookcases, and throwing out the files he collected for the book he never finished writing, saving only the love letters he'd written her when they were in their 60s. She told someone she didn't want to leave a mess for her kids. In her journal, she wrote about my father with a tenderness she could not express while she was caring for him. "I'm overwhelmed by sadness, missing the old Jeff as I knew him, his wit and compassion and his sheer liveliness. Oh God, how I miss him now." Her chest pain worsened and her breathlessness grew severe. "I'm aching to garden, to tidy up the neglect of my major achievement," she wrote. "Without it, the place would be so ordinary and dull. But so it goes. Accept, accept, accept." My mother's heart nurse called me, urging me to get my mother to reconsider surgery. My mother was so healthy in other ways, the nurse said. Uneasy, I called her personal doctor, Dr. Fales. "I know your mother well enough, and I respect her," he said. "She doesn't want to risk a surgery that could leave her debilitated or bound for a nursing home. I think I would make the same decision if it was my mom." I called my mother and said, "Are you sure? The surgeon said you could live to be 90. "I don't want to live to be 90, she said. "I'm going to miss you," I said, weeping. "You are not only my mother, you are my friend." That August, she had a heart attack. She was still in the hospital, in a step-down unit after several days in intensive care, when I got a call from yet another member of Middlesex Cardiology Associates who'd been handed my mother's case. The desire of doctors not to give up on my mother, to resist death, and to show their caring by doing something, anything, seemed unstoppable. The doctors were considering giving my mother coronary artery bypass grafts, plus the 2 valve replacement surgeries she'd rejected when she had a far better chance of surviving them. My mother seemed to be heading down the greased chute toward a series of Hail Mary surgeries, risky, painful, dangerous, and harrowing, each one increasing the chance that her death, when it came, would take place in intensive care. The cost to Medicare would probably have been in the $80,000 to $150,000 range, with higher payments if things had not gone well. More than a third of Medicare patients have surgery in their last year of life, nearly a tenth have surgery in the last month of life, and a fifth die in intensive care. Burning with anger, I told the astonished cardiologist that my mother had rejected surgery before her heart attack, and I saw no reason to subject her to it now. My intuitive revulsion, I would later discover, had a basis in medical evidence. One major study found that 13% of patients over 80 who underwent combined valve and bypass surgeries died in the hospital. In a smaller, confirming study, 13% died in the hospital, and an additional 40% were discharged to nursing homes. I called my mother in her hospital bed. "I think we're grasping." I stopped. "At straws," she said, finishing my sentence. She was quiet. "It's hard," she said, "to give up hope." 4 hours later, she called me back. "I want you to give my sewing machine to a woman who really sews," she said. "It's a Bernina. They don't make them like this anymore. It's all metal, no plastic parts." "But I'd like it," I said. "But Katy," she said, "you don't sew." I said, "You're right." "I'm ready to die," she said. "I'm at peace with all my children." She was overflowing. She told me she'd found a little spiral-bound book I'd made for her 80th birthday. "It was so loving," she said, "and oh, Katy, I didn't appreciate it." "Cherish Brian," she went on. She was talking about my partner, Brian. "You mean stop being a snob and cherish Brian?" I asked. "That's exactly what I mean. I love Brian," she said. "I love Brian for what he's done for you." An old Zen master once wrote, "Old plum tree bent and gnarled, all at once opens 1 blossom, 2 blossoms, 3, 4, 5 blossoms, uncountable blossoms, whirling, changing into wind, wild rain, falling, snow, all over the earth. My mother was like that." She came home from the hospital. My mother watched a moth emerge from a chrysalis brought over by a neighbor child and took her last photograph of its wet, crumpled wings. She took out her calligraphy pens, and on a small piece of paper, she brushed out her final circular enso and wrote beneath it, "For my memorial service." Three days later, I called her. I'd just come home from my local bookstore, where a former student had read from his new book about the ritual of tea, and I couldn't stop thinking of her. I remembered how she'd swirl boiling water into her beloved Japanese iron teapot to warm it. I remembered her attentively setting out thin, white bone china cups for my father and me. I remembered how, no matter how badly things were going, we'd gather each day at the kitchen table, waiting as the tea steeps, enjoying one another and simply being alive. But I had been too defensive and clumsy, too afraid of her criticism, and too much of a feminist bookworm to learn from her how to do this. In an outpouring, I told her all this. She was the one who had put her compassion into action and honor her vows and taken care of the man she'd loved. "But Katy," she said, her voice weak, after I finally finished talking, "you are yourself. You're good at other things." Then she said, "There isn't much time." That night she could not stop vomiting. She was taken back to the hospital with my brother following the ambulance in her white Camry. "Don't call your siblings," she told him when they got to the hospice unit. "They'll only panic and come." She had dry heaves and could not catch her breath. She took off her hammered silver earrings and said, "I want to get rid of all the garbage." She told my brother Michael to call my brother Jonathan and me. By the time he came back from the phone, she was dead. He broke into sobs. It could have been too much self-administered morphine or too little potassium. It could have been the stress of a cardiac catheterization. It could have been getting up and making martinis for the people who'd stopped by to see her. In the end, does it matter? She died of old age, sickness, and death. She died of a heart calcified and broken by 6 years of nonstop caregiving. She died of being 84. She was continent and lucid to her end. She took back her body from her doctors. She died the death she chose, not the death anyone else had in mind. She reclaimed her moral authority from the broken medical system that had held her husband hostage. She died like a warrior. Her dying was painful, messy, and imperfect, but that is the uncontrollable nature of dying. My brother called it a triumph.